know them sexually. They want Lot to send those men out so they can know them. And Lot offers his daughters, his virgin daughters, to them so that they don't do this evil thing. Well, the message of God smote those people blind. That's a miracle. They could see. It wasn't they were born blind. It wasn't that they gouged their eyes out. It was the fact that those messengers blinded them so they couldn't carry out that deed, because they were there for a purpose, to verify that the evil that was reported was true, and it was true. And then we saw another miracle where God told him not to look back. He had Lot and his wife and his two daughters escaped the city. And he said, don't look back. Well, Lot's wife looked back, and she turned into a pillar of salt. That's miraculous. We don't turn into pillars of salt, do we? That's not how life functions. Now, we can live and we can die through natural means, but we don't turn into pillars of salt. But she did, to confirm the fact that God said, don't look back. And when she did, it was obvious to everybody, you do what God tells you to do, and you don't violate that. And so I think Wednesday night maybe we spent just a little time talking about the burning bush, did we? And so we'll kind of pick up there. When God didn't sell him into slavery. God didn't cause his brethren to be jealous of him. But because they were jealous of him, because they did sell him into slavery, he used Joseph. And Joseph was usable. He was kept himself pure, and God gave him the ability to not only have dreams, but to interpret dreams. That's miraculous. We typically don't have that power. He could do that. He interpreted Pharaoh's dreams about the lean ears of corn eating up the fat ears, and the lean cattle eating up the fat cattle. And Joseph gave him those interpretations. And so where did Joseph say those came from? They came from God. That's not something you and I can do. Now, there may be occasions when you and I can have a dream and we say, I know where that came from. Here's what I've been dreading. I've been dreading that test for 6 months, and here it is. And so I dreamed I was taking a test. We kind of know the causes of some of our dumping of our anxieties during our dream sessions. But that's not a miraculous ability to interpret. That's just a life experience. But Joseph wouldn't have had any way to know Pharaoh's dream and the interpretation of it without God giving it to him. Joseph gave God credit for it. And through that process, we also see the providential nature of it. Joseph said to his brethren, you meant it for evil. That is, them selling him into slavery. But God used it for good. Because he used it for good, now Jacob and Joseph's brothers are part of that famine that comes after the 7 years of plenty. And because of the interpretation of the dream, Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of collecting all the grain, all the extra grain during the times of plenty, so that they could make it through those 7 years of lean. So everybody had to come to Egypt and purchase grain because there wasn't any to be had. So Jacob sends his sons down to fetch grain for them. Through that process, they eventually end up in Egypt, in the best part of Egypt, in the land of Goshen. And about 70 souls, Jacob and his descendants, are brought down there. Providentially, Joseph is there in a position to see that happens. Now, that part's not miraculous. Joseph just does what he needs to do in the way he needs to do it. He's obedient to God, and God uses him. And because of that, when this famine does come, he becomes that source of provision for his brethren. But he still had to make sure the grain was in the storage places. God didn't just fill up the silos. They had to gather it, put it into the silos, then he had to disperse it. He had to, in some cases, he took their land. They couldn't afford to buy it, and he said, look, you give the land to Pharaoh, and you'll be able to feed your family. So through that process, you see that the human responsibility wasn't taken away. But there are some miraculous things that we see. Now, go ahead.
In that process also you see that the prophetic. So he's not just interpreting their dreams, he's prophesying.
That's right.
Specifically to Pharaoh and to the butler and baker,
Yep.
what's going to happen to them.
Yep.
And so when that comes true, that substantiates his claim.
That's exactly right.
Coming to God, he's doing it.
And-
So they could have trusted him blindly, but that proved God.
And that's always the purpose. Always had been the purpose. Always will be would be the purpose throughout the Scriptures. That God confirms that what God said is true. It's coming from God. People say a lot of things. A lot of people have claimed to interpret dreams. You can still go to people our day and they'll read your palm. They'll say, okay, you see that little line that runs right there? Here's what that means. Well, they have the power to do that? Absolutely not. But do people believe they have the power? Many people do. What would that prove? If they showed you something there and somehow that came pass or close to coming to pass and you say, whoa, maybe they do have powers. And so when God said something and he did the miraculous deed, you say, what's being said has power behind it. And that's what was true, as Paul pointed out. And Joseph given the interpretation of the dream to Pharaoh, when that came to pass, when there were 7 years of plenty, what do you think Pharaoh thought? He trusted it was going to be true. He said, we need somebody in charge of that. You be in charge of that. So for 7 years, when they having plenty, don't you know when they got to the 6th year, he's thinking, one more year to go. And they're storing all this stuff up, and at the end of that 7 years, all of a sudden there became famine. Didn't have crops anymore. First year passed, second year passed, still don't have crops. What does Pharaoh know? What Joseph said from God. He gave credit to his God. It's coming true, and we're prepared for it. And so it confirms God's word, and that's the important part. So they all come down there. They spend 400 some odd years living in Egypt, multiplying. By the time they leave, over 1 million people leave Egypt. But there's a Pharaoh that comes to power that doesn't know Joseph, and so he persecutes the Israelites. In that persecution, even is afraid they're going to keep multiplying, so he commands that the male children be killed. Well, that's not carried out, and the midwives don't go along with it, and of course the parents don't go along with it. And Pharaoh's angry about that, and he becomes very belligerent, very punitive toward the Israelite people. So they cry to God for deliverance, and God sends a deliverer, Moses. And we talked, as we were ending our class last week, we talked about the burning bush. Moses flees into Midian because Pharaoh's trying to take his life, and he's seeing after his father-in-law sheep. And in chapter 3 of the book of Exodus, he sees a bush that's on fire, but it's not being consumed. And again, we understand that if a bush is on fire, it's going to burn up in the natural laws of combustion. It's going to be consumed. This one's on fire, but it's not being consumed. So Moses goes closer to see what this is about. And as he draws nigh, the voice from the bush, God speaks to Moses from the bush and says, Moses, Moses. Well, he knows he's been singled out, hadn't he? He's out here in the middle of nowhere, and this voice knows who he is. And Moses says, I'm here. And he said, draw not nigh hither, but put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. And moreover, he said, I am the Lord God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. So this miraculous deed confirmed what the voice is saying. I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now he had the context, the miraculous context, to say this typically doesn't happen. So the voice that's speaking unto me has to be God. And he listened to him, and God reflects or rehearses with Moses, and we'll fast forward through the familiar part, but try to underscore those miraculous contexts. But he tells Moses that he's heard the cry of the people and that he's going to deliver them. And Moses is to go and speak directly to Pharaoh and tell Pharaoh that God said, which God? The God that just spoke to him through the burning bush. That God. Who performed that miraculous deed that the bush wasn't consumed. That God. That God who identified himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You go tell Pharaoh to let my people go. His people had called and cried unto him because of the persecution. And Moses, you remember, makes excuses about that. I can't speak very well, and what am I going to say when they say, who sent you? He said, you tell them that I am have sent you. Well, who is I am? The one that spoke to Moses through the burning bush. This miraculous context of saying the one that provided the bush that's on fire that wasn't consumed, that God. You tell him that I am have sent you. And so he does go and speaks to Pharaoh eventually. You remember he has to send Aaron to be his mouthpiece. He does another miraculous deed in that process where he tells Moses to take his staff and throw it on the ground, and it becomes a serpent. And then he tells him to pick it up by the tail, and it becomes a staff again. So miraculous. That's not something that happens every day, is it? We know we've seen serpents, we've seen snakes, and some of us have walking canes, but we don't throw our walking canes down and they become snakes. It's miraculous. And so he demonstrates to him again, okay, I'm showing you that I am God. And what I'm telling you to do is from me. Now you listen to me. And Moses kind of holds on to that old staff from now on, doesn't he? That's just his reminder, God's with me. I'm doing what God told me to do. And this staff he'll use many times, and some of those times in a very miraculous way, to confirm that what God is saying is true. And so when they are delivered, there's a process that takes place to bring about that deliverance, and there are 10 plagues. Pharaoh's response was, when he heard from Moses, God said, let my people go, was, who is the Lord that I should obey him? You see, in Egypt at that time, the pharaohs were looked upon as gods themselves. And so if you think you're God and some other God tells you let my people go, you say, who do you think you are telling me what to do? So he didn't accept the message that Moses spoke. And so to confirm that message, and Paul mentioned this earlier, the confirmation that the message was from God and only from God was confirmed by miraculous deeds. And so there were a number of plagues that were sent upon them. A little episode where Moses and Aaron throw down their rods and they become serpents. But the magicians of Pharaoh threw down theirs, and theirs became serpents too. And yet the serpents of Moses and Aaron, that is the rods that became serpents, ate those of the magicians of Pharaoh. And in that process, Pharaoh's still not convinced. He's not going to let them go. So the first 3 plagues that take place, God demonstrated his power not only to Pharaoh, and that what he's saying comes from him, but also to the land of Israel, in Goshen, where they live. And so those first 3 plagues, the turning the water to blood, the frogs and the lice, were throughout the land of Egypt. It covered both where the Egyptians lived and where the Israelites lived. After those first 3, Israel was convinced. It's God speaking. Moses is speaking for God. But Egypt wasn't. That is, Pharaoh wasn't convinced. And so the remaining plagues were directed directly to the Egyptians, specifically to make sure that the the gods of the Egyptians were completely debunked because they couldn't do anything. You have among those, again, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time looking at each of them, but beginning at Exodus chapter 8 and verse 22, you have the flies, and then that's followed by the Miriam of the cattle, and then the boils, the hail, the locusts, the darkness, and then the death of the firstborn. After each one of those, there was no relief from those plagues until God's spokesman, Moses, interceded and God relieved them. Pharaoh would say, talk to your God and tell him to make this go away. Well, Moses would go talk to God and God would make it go away. And for a period of time, Pharaoh's like, okay, if you'll talk to your God and this goes away, then I'll let the people go. And then it says Pharaoh would harden his heart. Then he'd change his mind, say, well, that might have just been a fluke. But you notice in all those, who's in control? Who does have any power? The gods of the Egyptians. Why didn't they intercede? Why didn't their God say, we're not going to have flies? No, our cattle not going to be diseased. Why did he have to go back to Moses and say, ask your God to please take this plague away? That miraculous deed of the plagues confirmed that God's the one with the power. And what God's requiring of you, you better be willing to do, or else. And so all those plagues, we've looked at them in a number of different ways as we've gone through the scriptures in our study. And we kind of know the people that are engaged because we looked at men and women of the Old and New Testament. And we've looked at it geographically, where Egypt is located, where the wilderness took place, the journey toward the promised land, all those things. But now we get to look at some of the miraculous things that were taking place during that time in those locations that confirmed that what God was saying was true. And after the death of the firstborn, again, the first three affected all of them. Israel needed to be convinced too. Moses anticipated that, didn't he? Now, what am I going to say if they say, who sent you? And that's what they ask. Who are you? And so he did tell them who he was and who had sent him, but these first three plagues let them know the only way those are removed is when Moses, who claimed to be sent by God, intercedes to our God so these plagues are removed. So Israel was convinced a lot more quickly than the Egyptians. But eventually go ahead.
I don't want to back you up too much, but when Moses was at the burning bush, there's another one that we don't talk about that much, but he put his hand in his garment
yeah.
and put it out to turn leprous.
Yep. That's right.
Because you prayed for those that have spiritual sickness. That's one of those pictures of type that begins to set the stage for
Yep.
God having the power to heal sickness too. It's going to happen with Naaman. It's going to happen several times with Christ. This idea of sickness, and since I have the power to heal sickness, then I have power to do other things.
That's a great point. We didn't read that, but also included in God convincing Moses to go and do what he tells him to do. He tells Moses to stick his hand inside his bosom, and it becomes leprous. And he tells him to stick it back in, and it pulls it out as like a baby's skin. Again, who has the power? God does. And as Paul pointed out, that the healing power that God provides is demonstrated there. Miraculously, it's demonstrated there. That'll also be used, and that is that leprous condition will also be used in a miraculous way to curse Miriam. You remember when she rebelled against Moses, spoke against Moses, then she was smitten with leprosy. Again, miraculous. She didn't do anything to bring leprosy on her, being unclean, but she's so disobedient to God. And so the confirmation that God had chosen Moses, and Moses is the one who's going to speak for him, when she rebelled against that.
That made her unclean.
That's right. That's made her unclean. But it was a miraculous bringing that leprosy on him. So that's a good point. You see those woven in here that makes it undeniable that this is a God thing, that God is demonstrating His power, and what God is saying you better listen to, because He's the one that has the power to override nature and cause these things to happen. After the death of the firstborn, then the Egyptians and Pharaoh were convinced that they needed to let these people go, and they even gave them jewels and riches and supplies so that they could leave. They wanted them gone because every Egyptian household experienced the death of their firstborn. And there was wailing, mourning throughout all the land of Egypt. But not so in Israel. Why? Not so in Goshen. Because they followed God's instructions and they put the blood over the doorpost. And so death passed over them. Didn't take any firstborn. So here they are convinced, we did what God told us to do. We were spared. Our firstborn was spared. The Egyptian didn't do what God told them to do, and now they're convinced we should have, because now all their firstborn are dead. So they wanted them to leave. And so as they're leaving, they get out of the grips of Pharaoh, at least a distance from Pharaoh. And they find themselves in Exodus chapter 13 and 14. They find themselves off in the wilderness right next to the Red Sea. Well, behind them is Egypt and Pharaoh. And Pharaoh's heart is hardened again. You know, he's gone through his period of mourning for his firstborn, and now he's angry. And now he realizes everybody that's done all the work for him is gone. And so he sends his armies to fetch them back. And so they're gathered, encamped at the Red Sea, and they are panic-stricken. That is, the Israelites are. They see Pharaoh's armies coming, and they see the vastness of the Red Sea, and they're told to stand still and to see the salvation of the Lord. To tell the people, stand still. A little hard to stand still when you're panic-stricken, isn't it? But he said, you tell them to stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. And then he said, in an astounding way, they're going to get to see the miraculous parting of the Red Sea. He said, tell the people, go forward. Guess where forward is? On that occasion, forward was into the Red Sea. So if they're standing here, the miraculous deed took place. He parted walled up the walls of the water. He placed a fire that would guide them by night and a cloud that would protect them by day. And those people walk across the Red Sea on dry land. Now this is not just Pine Street Church of Christ Sunday morning Bible class. It's going to take a little trip across the Red Sea. This is more than 1 million people that are going to have to march across that Red Sea. This is an undeniable, inescapable, miraculous context. Who's telling them to stand still? Who's telling them to go forward? Well, God is. And what does God do? Demonstrate that when I tell you to go forward, I'm going to make a way for you. And there it is. And so Pharaoh's army sees that. And again, you'd think alarms would go off, wouldn't you? You'd think alarms would go off, and they'd say, don't you dare try that. If their God is parting that Red Sea, we better turn around and go home. They pursue after them. And all that mass of Israelites get all the way across the Red Sea on the other side. And God allows Pharaoh and his armies, or Pharaoh's armies, to enter that Red Sea with the waters walled up, and then he collapses the wall upon them. Well, you're talking about miraculous. God speaking, God demonstrated that what's being spoken is from Him because He's performing these miracles to confirm that that's from Him. Nobody else can do that. And all these people, by responding to what He told them to do, were delivered from Pharaoh and his armies. And that's just an astounding thing for us to be able to read about and see the miraculous deeds and what took place and how important that is for us to recognize that God cares for us and that He confirmed these things by His demonstrating His miraculous power. Just one little thing that if you do much reading in those that are referred to in the philosophical and theological world as critics, and they're not referred to as critics just because they complain about everything. They're called critics because they try to cast doubt on biblical truths. And so some of the critics have written over the years and say, well, it was really just a swampy area, and they made their way across the swamp, and you and I know that's not true, but even if that were true, then how were the Israelites able to get across and a whole army of people are drowned in the swamp? Because what was deliverance for one became destruction for the other. So either He drowned all the Egyptian armies in the swamp, or He parted the Red Sea the way the Bible says He did, and they walked across on dry land. And so those are things that you and I want to pay attention to. In the midst of that, we see that obviously these people are going to have to be fed. How do you feed over 1 million people? 603,000 men above the age of 20, and you add the women and children, and in there you've got over 1 million people. How do you feed them? Well, the answer to that is miraculously. He gave them manna, bread from heaven. Jesus even described that in the book of John when He calls Himself the bread of life. He refers back to them being fed with manna from heaven. But He said those who ate that bread still died. And when the manna was provided, they had to go out 6 days and pick up every day manna. The purpose of that miraculous provision of food was to remind them every single day that God promised to take care of you. He's taking care of you. On the 6th day, they had to pick up twice as much so they could rest on the Sabbath day. And so they practiced that. Now, not our purpose to get into all the murmuring, but after a while they got tired of the coriander seed, the sweet bread. They said, we loathe this bread. So they didn't fully appreciate it, but the fact that they could go pick it up every day is like dew covering the ground. They'd go out, and if they picked up more than they were allotted to pick up, guess what? Worms got in it. And so do what God tells you to do. Every day you're reminded God is providing it. It's a miraculous provision of food. That will last until they cross the Jordan River into the Promised Land. He'll provide that food for them. Every single day is a confirmation that He promised to care for them. And that confirms in God's promise. And on 2 occasions, He provides water for them. They murmur because they're thirsty, and on one occasion God tells Moses to smite the rock, and remember water comes forth. The second occasion in Numbers 20 He tells them to speak to the rock, and Moses smites it anyway. And Moses didn't get to go into the Promised Land because of that. But whether he smote it as God told him to, or he spoke to it as God told him to, miraculously God gave them water. And their thirst was quenched. The rock itself didn't provide it. God provided it. And so He does that. On at least 2 occasions, He feeds them with quail. They get a little tired of that light bread, and they complain about it. And so He blows in, miraculously blows in quail, and they get to eat. He announces that He's going to give them flesh to eat. And it said while the flesh was still in their teeth, they complained. And so the miraculous is everywhere. God confirming that He's with them, that He's going to care for them, and the finger of God is everywhere. Before we leave it, the bell's about to ring, but don't want to miss this point. And let me find my place. In 1 Corinthians 10, since we're talking about the walls of water and the cloud above them, Paul described it this way to the Corinthian Christians when he reminds them in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 1, "Moreover, brethren, I would not have that ye should be ignorant how that all our fathers were under the cloud and all passed through the sea." Talking about the crossing of the Red Sea. "And were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea." Because they were covered up. Just like baptism is today, when we're baptized into Christ, we're covered up in the water. We're buried. Romans 6 describes it as a burial. We're buried with Christ in baptism. It is an immersion, not a sprinkling, not a pouring. What happened to the Israelites? They had walls of water on each side. They were covered up, cloud above them. And it's used in that way here in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And he said, "And all did eat of the same spiritual meat, and all did drink of the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ." So none of this that's happening is haphazardly or reactionary. This is God's plan. And all along the way, it's confirmed as God's plan by the miraculous deeds that we witness.
Exactly. Just like at the flood, and just like with the doorpost in the blood, those that don't pass through the other side through the water, it shows us where that saving place is.
That's right.
Where
Yep.
what saves one person kills another person.
Right. It has to be obedience. And he gave them every reason to be obedient. When you compare what God said and what happens to those that don't do what God says, and what happens to those who do, then pretty clear, isn't it? And that's true of us. Good stuff. Thank you for your comments.